you this afternoon because I want to issue a challenge to students, to faculties, to advocates, to professionals here in the community. I want you to make this your best year yet. I want you to make this the year that you live to the absolute fullest extent. I think I've come to realize that ultimately our lives are defined by the experiences that we have. It is the experiences that we live that ultimately define who each and every one of us tends to be. It is the experiences that we live that create the novel that tells our story and tells our life. I think I've ultimately come to realize that like a novel, that like a great work of art, it must contain tremendous hardship. It must contain tremendous challenge and adversity. While at the same time, it must also be filled with triumph, excitement, energy, and glory. But there can be no novel that is worth reading that does not have both, that does not have the challenge and hardship coupled with adversity and difficulty. For any novel that just has glory, that just has excitement, that just has joy, would not be a true novel. And it would be not be a novel that you would study, that you would look at, that you would even attempt to try to understand. I remember laying at Mount Sinai Hospital in tremendous pain with an uncertain future. And I remember a rabbi coming to my bedside, and he spoke the words that I ultimately needed to hear at that time and at that moment. For as I laid in bed with an uncertain future, in the midst of total chaos, I will always remember what the rabbi spoke to me. He said, other than the choice that we as if individuals make as it pertains to the power that exists between the power and forces of good versus evil, that all else that happens in our lives, that all else that happens to us has been inscribed, has been put forth, has been edged in the great book of life. But the one power, the one thing that we as individuals are in charge of, have the power to control, is how do we react to that which has ultimately been chosen for us. It is our choice. It is up to us to determine what our course is going to be. For as we go through life and we examine that which happens to each and every one of us, that which is fair versus that which is hard, it is up to us. It is our choice how we choose to react, how we choose to push forward, how we choose to live our life. I have ultimately come to the conclusion that whether it's true or not, if you're able to believe that you're part of something bigger, that you're part of something grander, that you're part of something more noble than what we can possibly begin to know, understand, or even begin to appreciate. But if you're able to believe that things that happen to you happen for a reason, they happen for a purpose, it will allow for you to live a life of greater meaning and greater joy. I always share this story. It's a story of a young mother who called me, and she said, Richard, she said, I have been a religious person my entire life. The thing that I wanted more than anything else was to be given a child. But what am I supposed to do? For the child that I was given was born with a severe disability. The mother went on to ask, what type of a life is my child going to have? Is he going to have any friends? Is he going to get an education? Is he going to live independently? Will he have a job? Will he take a wife? Will he have a family? Is there going to be anything about my child, this wonderful lady asked, that's going to be remotely ordinary to that of other children? And I remember responding to her by saying, there will be nothing about your child that's going to be ordinary. For your child was sent here with a greater mission, with a greater goal, with a greater purpose. For your child was sent here to be extraordinary. See, when we ask ourselves the question, especially on such a week like this one, which is, why is it that people like us exist? Why is it, we ask, that bad things happen to otherwise such good people? And I think the answer sometimes tends to go something like this. That ultimately, those here in this room, those who have dedicated their lives to representing and fighting and educating and working on behalf of people with disabilities, on behalf of families with children with special needs, those families who have children with special needs, those among us here today that have disabilities, we have come to know this answer. We have come to know that an easy life does not always correspond to a good one. But ultimately it is the case that it is those who walk among us who know adversity, who know hardship, who know difficulty, who know pain, who know struggle, come to understand their purpose in the world. So often you find on a college campus, students are trying to find their place in the world. They're trying to figure out, where do they fit in? What role should they be playing? But when you look to those with disabilities, what you tend to find is the one gift that people who have disabilities tend to have, the one gift that their families and their friends have, is the incredible gift of perspective. It's the gift that allows for us to know for what is important versus what is not important, for what we should focus on versus what shouldn't be looked at. See, I would contend and I would argue, as I said in the beginning of our discussion today, that those who walk among us, that those who are blessed to have a certain sense of adversity, a certain sense of struggle, a certain sense of pain, a certain sense of hardship, most often tend to be the ones who understand what their purpose and why they're here. If you're able to live your life with that incredible sense of purpose, with that incredible sense of meaning, with that incredible sense of mission, if you're able to realize that perhaps that which happens to you is part of the greater good, if you're able to realize how fleeting life ultimately is, and that the more experience that you have been given, the more you're able to connect with others, connect with people, the more you're able to understand what your role is. When you know your role, you know your purpose. When you know your purpose, you know your reason. When you know your reason, you know your mission. When you know your mission, you come to truly know life. I always like to share the story of of the starter pistol sounding in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I've been blessed to have the opportunity to complete 17 marathons and the full Ironman competition in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I want you to imagine, if you would, what it was like to dive into a frigid body of water. The water temperature of Lake Coeur d'Alene that morning was 55 degrees. Imagine the feeling you have to be swimming in darkness, not having any idea where you're going, not having any idea where you are, and not having any idea of just how far it is you have to go. Imagine the feeling you have as while you're swimming, to be unable to communicate with your guide. The only thing connecting you is a thin rope that goes around your waist and around his. But you can't communicate because you're underwater. Imagine the feeling you have as you repeatedly get kicked over and over again in the face by other swimmers. But being blind, you're unable to brace for the impending impact. Imagine that feeling you have as you continue with the swim, you try to surface to get much needed oxygen, but you're simply unable to do so. Because as you attempt to surface, another swimmer is immediately above you. Imagine the feeling you have as while you're swimming, other swimmers become entangled in the rope that's your lifeline to your guide. And as they become entangled, the rope begins to constrict. As the rope begins to constrict, it starts to tighten. As it tightens, you start to panic. As you start to panic, the rope drags you below the surface. And as you get dragged below the surface, the air becomes more and more difficult to get. So you try to reach your head above the waves, but you can't because the rope is pulling you below. And the waves continue to crash above you. And the oxygen becomes impossible to get. You start to realize something at that time and at that moment. That you have to calmly and methodically and quietly untangle the rope, untangle yourself from the intertwining situation that you have with all the other swimmers. You have to do it methodically and calmly and quietly. And you have to learn to press forward where the entire process repeats itself over and over again. After which, you board your tandem bike and ride for 112 miles through the mountains of Idaho. After which, you run your full 26.2-mile marathon. I share this story with you for this reason. What I have learned through my travels and through my experiences is that no matter how hard or challenging or difficult things ultimately become, no matter how hopeless things tend to be, I have come to realize that you will ultimately have that what you need when you need it. You'll have no more, but you will always have no less. The reason that I love, absolutely love, spending time at a college is because I love having a chance to be with students. Because I wish that people had told me some of these things when I was in college. It might have made things a little easier. Or perhaps I wish that I had learned to listen better when I was in college to those who were trying to tell me these types of things. But I think that athletics is a tremendous model. Because I think athletics helps to explain life. It helps to explain life at its core. It helps to explain life at its essence. See, I have come to believe that everything that happens in athletics happens throughout the entire life cycle that each and every one of us experiences and that each and every one of us is going to encounter. And I always challenge people to look at your life the way that you would look at a marathon. Because I think a marathon is the perfect story. It's the perfect guide. It's the perfect narrative to how you can see all the phases that you tend to go through, that you tend to encounter, that you tend to experience. My favorite marathon is the New York City Marathon. When you begin the New York City Marathon, for those of you who are younger, for those of you who are college students, for those of you who are younger students, for those of you who are parents, think of the life that you're experiencing now as though you're running the New York City Marathon. It applies to all things. As you begin the marathon, you begin on Staten Island. When you start, there's a sense of euphoria. There's a sense of excitement. There's a sense of energy and enthusiasm and spirit that fills you. Just like when you start college, or just like when you start a job, or just like when you start anything for the first time, the novelty is so exciting because it's new and it's different. It's unique. It's wonderful. Anything new is always going to be exciting. Anything new is always going to make you feel good. But whether you're going to college or starting a job or having a child or beginning a relationship or whatever that life cycle is that you're at, you ultimately come to mile 7 in your race. And when you reach mile 7, the novelty starts to fade. The excitement starts to wane. It doesn't have that same feel that it had at the beginning. Ultimately, what tends to happen at mile 7 is dreams and idealism gets replaced by wisdom of the circumstance, of the situation. But you press forward. And you ultimately find your way to mile 13. Whether you're raising a special needs child, whether you have a disability, whether you're trying to find your way, mile 13 is a real challenge. Because at mile 13, you have run a great distance. You have gone incredibly far. But when you get to mile 13, you realize that you're only halfway. You have given it all you've got. You have worked incredibly hard. But when you get to that mile 13, you start to realize you have a long way to go. For those of you familiar with New York, when you hit mile 13, you start to realize that you're almost out of gas. The pain is starting to become real. Difficulty is starting to truly set in. But you come to realize that you're only in the borough of Brooklyn. For those familiar with the New York City Marathon, you realize that you have to move forward and have to find your way through Queens. You have to cross the 59th Street Bridge. You have to run up the length of First Avenue. You have to enter through the South Bronx. You have to circle back out over the Madison Avenue Bridge. You have to find your way to Fifth Avenue. You have to make your way down all of Fifth Avenue. You have to find your way to 59th Street. You have to cross over at Central Park South. You have to enter Columbus Circle. You have to re-enter the park and finish at Tavern on the Green. what I always share with people, whether you have had this experience or going to have experience like this, you will all encounter a mile 20. Mile 20 has always been defined as the runner's wall. It's called the runner's wall because every step you take hurts. Everything you do hurts. It doesn't matter if you've done 1 marathon or 17 marathons. At mile 20, the pain is real. And every time your foot hits the ground, it reverberates throughout your entire body, throughout your entire core. But something extraordinary happens at mile 20, and it's something that people with disabilities can know and appreciate more than anybody else. Because at mile 20, something extraordinary happens. At mile 20, you recognize that even though your body is infirmed, that even though your body is mortal, that if given the opportunity, the spirit can disconnect from the body. That if given the opportunity, the spirit can disconnect from the flesh. That if given the opportunity, the spirit can ultimately transcend. People with disabilities come to teach this lesson all too well. That even though we have certain limitations, our spirits and our souls are able to soar. And it's through our spirit and our soul that the body can move forward. It is through our spirit and our soul that the body can start to find its way, that the body can start to follow. That you can reach mile 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. We ask ourselves that eternal question. The eternal question that takes us back to the book of Job. Why is it that there are some who walk among us that have a greater burden? Why is it that there are some who walk among us that have a greater struggle, that have a greater hardship and a greater difficulty that they have to deal with? Why is it that there's some who walk among us that have a greater burden, a greater challenge than others? Why are there some who walk among us who seem to have to work that much harder? Who seem to have a life where nothing comes easy, where they simply never get a break? The biblical question, the age-old question that every disabled person inevitably asks, that every sick person inevitably asks, that every parent inevitably asks, is why? If I have done all that I am supposed to do, if I have followed the rules, if I have done all that is asked, why? Why is it that bad things happen to otherwise such good people? There is one story that I always share whenever I speak, because it's a story that helps us to understand the answer to that question. At least it helps us to understand the way I see it. Everyone has a story, everyone has a life, everyone has an experience. The reason I love spending time with you today is because I'm hoping that I can just share my experience, my perspective, my understanding of the world. And hopefully, by doing that, you'll see how I look at things, or attempt to look at things, attempt to deal with things, and make your own decision as to how you, whether you're disabled or the family member of a disabled person or the friend of a disabled person or a person who works in this area, chooses to look at things, experience things, understand things. One of the things that I always wanted to do, I wanted to serve in the U.S. military. I wanted to be a JAG officer, which simply stands for Judge Advocate General, simply a military attorney. Understandably so, I was turned down because of my disability. But I had an incredible opportunity to work with an Israeli fighter pilot. And we began an incredible mission to help integrate the Israeli Defense Forces so that anybody who wished to serve could have the opportunity to do so in non-combat, support-related positions in non-forward bases. The idea being that military service in Israel is compulsory, so allowing for people with disabilities, regardless as to whether the disability is a physical disability or a cognitive disability. But if they wish to have the opportunity to serve, they should be given that chance. But in order to make this work, my friend and I were told that we couldn't just rely on the orders coming down from the Curia. The Curia is their Pentagon, kind of analogous to a university. You can't simply rely on the top to tell all the department heads and department chairs and different divisions to do something. If you really want to make it work, you have to get buy-in from all the parties, from everyone involved. So the Curia told us that of course we support this. Of course this is great, and you have our unconditional support. But it's going to be your job. It is going to be your responsibility. It's your mission for you to travel the nation, for you to work with all the base commanders, for you to visit all the different units. It is up to you to convince the local base commanders that integration of people with disabilities is a good idea, is helpful. It's up to you to show them that this isn't just another community service, but that this will contribute to combat readiness, that there's a benefit to them for doing this. The plan that we came up with was to use athletics. We traveled through the country doing triathlons and marathons. And as we did the triathlons and we did the marathons, it helped for the base commanders. It helped for special forces to start to realize that, wow, these folks might not be able to handle a weapon, but they've got incredible endurance. They have incredible passion. They have incredible tenacity. These are the kind of people who will work hard and do what is necessary. For just like at a university, it is not just all about what happens in the president's office or the dean's office. Just like in a military, it's not just about what happens on the fighter plane or the tank or on the field. In order to make all of that work, it's reliant upon the thousands upon thousands of people that go into that create the logistics, that do the organization, that put forth the effort to allow for that tank, to allow for that fighter jet, to allow for that combat soldier to do his mission. It was the day before the Jerusalem Marathon. I was giving a presentation just like this. A story I share always, for it resonates the point. It was the day before the marathon, and the country and the city were excited. There had been tremendous press put into this event, put into this activity. I'll always remember hearing the sound of sirens, the wail of emergency vehicles, the voice on loudspeakers. I was apprised that Jerusalem had been subject to its most violent terrorist attack in over 15 years. A pregnant woman from Scotland was killed, and 50 other people were critically injured. The military came to me and we spoke about it, and they said, it's important for you to know this. The bomb exploded in the heart of the city. The marathon was the intended target. In this part of the world, one attack is always followed by many. But they said, this will be the most important race you ever do. This will be the most important mission you ever participate in. We have worked so hard on the press to showcase this program, to showcase this initiative. It must go forward. To not would show weakness. Why do bad things happen to good people? My last remaining moments, I'll share with you a story. It was a beautiful morning in Central Park. I remember walking in the park, and I'd memorized Central Park. I know where all the inclines and the declines. I know where all the crevices are. I know the park incredibly well. I was walking in the park, and I was preparing for what was going to be my 18th marathon. I was excited. I was feeling really good. As I was walking in the pedestrian lane of the park, I remember approaching the bottom of a major hill as a cyclist approached the top. As I was at the bottom of the hill, the cyclist was going at a speed of in excess of 35 miles per hour. Unfortunately, when he hit the hill, he lost control of his bicycle. As he lost control of his bicycle, he veered into the pedestrian lane. As he came into the pedestrian lane at such a high rate of speed, not having control of his cycle, he crashed into my back. We ask ourselves the eternal question: why do bad things happen to good people? For me, I've spoken about athletics because athletics was my voice. Athletics was finally the way that I was able to be strong. Athletics was finally the thing that I had found that allowed for me to be independent. It allowed for me to be not just the blind person, but the athlete. Athletics had created camaraderie. Athletics had given me friendship. Athletics had given me tremendous, tremendous new self-awareness. Athletics had allowed for me to deal with that which many disabled people deal with: self-confidence, strength. I think we ask ourselves the eternal question, which is why? Why would you do this? Why would something like this happen? Person who finally found their place through athletic competition, who finally found their identity and their strength through being an athlete, why would you strike them down? Why in a matter of an instant, would you take that all away? Would you, in a matter of a moment, turn them into a person who would have to become a trauma patient? Who would have to spend 10 weeks in a hospital? Whose independence was his whole life to not being able to do the most basic of things? Using a toilet or taking a shower. Not even being able to put clothes on. Having to deal with a level of pain that was indescribable. We go back in time to the Jerusalem Marathon. It was a beautiful morning as we began the race. As we ran through the streets of Jerusalem with the IDF and the Israeli press and all the various media, the day after a violent attack, the press, I think, helped to state it best. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do some of us have a greater burden than others? They wrote that seeing somebody deal with their severe disability, their blindness, deal with their fear, their uncertainty, their unknowns, made it just a little easier for people. Made it easier for people to start going back on city buses they rode. Made it easier for people to start going back to work. Mothers sending their kids to school, fathers going to their offices. It made it just a little bit easier for a city to start to move forward. This November, it's going to be my plan to complete the New York City Marathon. It will not be the same marathon that I used to do. Marathon running was my life. It was the thing I loved the most, and I used to do it relatively fast. It's simply not going to be that. It's going to be incredibly painful. It is going to be an incredible struggle. It is going to be an incredibly difficult activity. Because, as I was told, the pain is going to worsen as you continue to move through the city. It's not going to be fast. It's going to be slow. But it'll be a marathon nonetheless. See, ultimately, I think as we attempt to answer that eternal question, why do some have a greater burden than others? I think the answer goes something like this. All of us reach a point in our life where we have to make a simple decision. We have to decide that when we reach a certain point, we have to focus our energy and our effort on simply not trying to get over it. We have to come to the realization it's time to just get on with it. I think we as disabled people and friends of disabled people and communities that work with disabled people come to know all too well that we will do what is hard to achieve what is great because we come from a heritage, a lineage, a people, a history that hungers for greatness. So thank you all very much. Yes, we'll definitely take some questions if they'd like.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. So folks, what we're going to do right now is this is my favorite part of the activity is when we do questions. What I'd like you to do, if you could do me a favor, is I'd like you to think of the most personal questions that you can think of. The more personal the question, I think the better it is, because that's how we can actually relate to one another. The more personal, the better. And the second thing is when you ask your question, I think what we'll do is Anna, I guess we'll just call on the folks. And then what I'm asking you to do as a favor, if you could, is if you could tell me your name and whether you're a student or kind of what your relationship is. That way I'll be able to address you properly. So if you're a student, if you could tell me the year that you're a student. If you're not a student, if you could tell me that you're not a student, and if you're faculty, whatever your role is. It just allows for me to address you more directly. So Anna, if you could just see if there's any questions.
My name is Austin.
Yes, Austin.
What does it feel like when you're finishing one of those marathons? Can you find a lot of speed to finish the marathon, or is it like, I'm so tired, this hurts so much?
Sure. Well, Austin, just so I can address you properly, you sound a little younger. So are you a student here, or are you younger?
Oh, I'm young.
Okay, but what are you, high school, middle school?
Middle school.
Okay, very good. Okay, so Austin's question, which is a great question for those who didn't hear, is, when you get to the finish line, how do you approach the finish line? Do you feel energized? Do you feel excited? Do you feel enthused? I think different competitions kind of end in different ways. When you're finishing the marathon, marathons are different because you finish with a real crowd of people. So there's a certain energy, and you always have that last bit of push, and it allows for you to kind of finish with that energy that you need to kind of get over the line. I think for the Ironman is different, because the Ironman, that's a more emotional finishing, because when you finish the Ironman, you're alone. It was myself and my guide. So when you're doing a marathon, there's like thousands of people that are all finishing at once. But for the Ironman, it's very much solitary. So when you finish, it's you and your guide. And there's no one around you. There's no one in back of you, and there's no one in front of you, because it thins out so much because of the duration of the race. So I think for the Ironman, it's a little bit more emotional in the sense of that you had worked for 2 years to reach that point, and that literally 2 years of practices and scheduling and training and working and all of that had finally kind of come to a close when you reach that finish line. And I think it's a very powerful feeling. Now, what's going to happen in New York is going to be very different, because this is just simply not going to be a great marathon for me. It's going to be horrible. It's going to be a bad time. It's going to be very slow. But it's going to be the hardest of the marathons because of the pain levels. And so that's going to be a very unique type of an experience, just because of the unbelievable difficulty that's going to come with trying to do this. And people ask, why are you going to do this? And the reason I'm doing it is really because I don't want things to end with an accident. I don't want it to be that it was 17 marathons, it was an Ironman, it was the Israelman, it was all of these things, and that it all ended with one accident. It just shouldn't be that. It just can't be that this is going to be the end. So that's why I'm doing this marathon. It will be the worst of the marathons I've ever done, but I need to do it because I just can't end it this way. Other questions?
Lloyd, ask a question.
Please.
Sure. How you doing, Mr. Bernstein?
Good.
I really appreciate your openness and vulnerability and transparency. And then, so I am a student here, a graduate student. in
Okay.
social work.
Oh, very good.
I also have a physical disability, mobility aid.
Okay.
Get around. And so I was really drawn in by what you talk about in terms of the passion, the endurance.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that comes from a lot of times from how we were raised.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, some folks who have disabilities don't grow up in households where they're told that you can do whatever you need to do. You can push, you can fight, you can be tough, you can endure and push on and try and do great things. Fortunately, I had a mother who did that. And I'm just wondering if you share some about your childhood in terms of the type of lessons or messages that your parents use to instill this value in yours.
That is an outstanding question. That is an absolutely outstanding, and I'm so grateful that you asked that question, because you're tapping into something I always get concerned about, which is people sometimes, when they hear you speak and they see a blind person doing these different things, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, I know a blind person. Why can't he do all these things? And your question goes right to the heart of that. And the answer is, look, at the end of the day, I was very lucky. 80% of the blind community is unemployed. The reason for that isn't because blind people or other people with disabilities, I don't know the stats for other disabilities, I just know it for my own, they're just as smart. They're just as talented. They have that same energy. They have that same drive. They have that same endurance. They have all of that. They have all of that. But they weren't blessed to be born into a family that I was born into. So much of what I talk about is resource driven. I would say the vast majority of it is economic driven, completely economic driven. If you're able to go to the best schools, if you're able to have the best teachers, if you're able to have the best assistants, if you're able to have the best advocates, if you're able to, when the structure or the system becomes unfair, if you're able to be able to turn to people who can say, that's unacceptable, that isn't right, that's not the way it's supposed to be, that makes all the difference. So I would really argue that ultimately it's the case that when you look at people with disabilities, you have to always recognize the story that everyone comes with. It's the stories that go into our novel. It's the stories that make up our lives. And I think when you look at the story, you have to always recognize that not everyone has the same story. And I'm just going to be really direct. If I didn't come from the background that I came from, if I didn't have the economic privilege that I was born with, if I didn't have the structure of support that I was given, if I didn't have all of these external factors, every one of these external factors was going my way. Every one of them was. If I didn't have those external factors, if I didn't have those external blessings, if I didn't have those external advantages, there's no way that any of this would have happened. I'm just going to tell it to you right off the bat. There's absolutely no way that any of this happens. So I always think it's very important, especially for people who work with people with disabilities, to recognize that if you have a blind person or a wheelchair user or anyone with a disability who has just made it to the University of Michigan, who is attending school here, they don't have to go on to do marathons and Ironman and all these crazy things. I've been blessed that I have the opportunity to do those things so that I do them. But what you always have to recognize is I had a chance to meet some students here that I have known for a long time, who when they just started off, were starting in college, at a different school, and now they're at the University of Michigan. The simple fact that you have people with disabilities that are here at this university is remarkable in and of itself, is monumental in and of itself, is something that should be celebrated in and of itself. So what you always have to recognize and always have to remember is that every single person who's in this room or on this campus has done something that is nothing short of a miracle. That's what has to be recognized. That's what has to be appreciated. So often I think it becomes problematic almost when you hear about blind people climbing mountains or other people with severe disabilities doing these remarkable things. And they're remarkable. And what it ultimately does, and this is what concerns me, it sets the bar at a ridiculous level. Because basically what you're saying is not only should you be disabled, but you need to go off and do all of these crazy things. And that's simply not the case at all. Because what's happened is in terms of how people have moved forward and what has happened, is that in a way it's very exciting because expectations have been shattered. People can do anything they want to do in the most remarkable, incredible ways. But I think what we have to be very cautious of is we have to be cautious of holding people out who have done these crazy things. Whether it's climbed Mount Everest or done an Ironman or running a company or whatever it is. In any population, there's always going to be people who do those kinds of things. But what you have to do is that should not be the benchmark. What should be the benchmark, what should be celebrated, is where people are today, what they've accomplished and what they've achieved from their own life experiences, from their own novel, and from who they are. Other questions?
Charlie?
Yes.
My name is Charlie.
Yes.
66 years old, a student of life.
Yes.
And my question is sort of this. I think you might agree with me that I have sort of an Alcoholics Anonymous view of disability rights. That the AA says that the way that an alcoholic can help himself is by helping another alcoholic. And I think that the way that a disabled person can help themselves is by helping another disabled person, by advocating for disabled person's rights. And I know that's an aspect of your life that you haven't really touched upon in this talk. And I know that you've done a lot of that. And I think that that's how we help ourselves, by doing this for others.
I would totally agree. I think it gives you, going back to kind of our conversation prior, I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think what it does is that anything that gives you a sense of purpose, I have to be honest with you, I like being busy because I have chronic pain issues from my accident. So for me, if I'm able to be busy and active, I find that to be helpful. If I wasn't active, I wasn't busy, I would basically have to think about it all the time, and that would be hard. It doesn't mean that you're still not uncomfortable for a lot of parts of your day and your night, but at the same time, at least you have something to look forward to, and at least it gives you something to kind of get excited about and do. And I think that's important. And I would wholly agree with that, because it really, I think the day-to-day activities and having stuff to do and focus on can distract you sometimes. For those of you who are dealing, and I'm sure there's some people here who are dealing with pain management issues, pain is a really tough thing, because for those of you who are dealing with it, I empathize. For those of you who aren't dealing with it, or you're a faculty member, if a student comes and says that they have some pain issues or pain struggles, you have to always take that seriously, because you might not see it, but what happens is that people who deal with chronic pain issues, it's hard for them, because what pain does is pain takes away from your basic ability to enjoy daily activities and daily life. It's very problematic. So you just have to recognize that. And I guess the point of Charlie's question is, if you take on an issue or a mission or a purpose or a focus, in a way that's helpful to you, because it allows for you to be distracted long enough to focus on other things other than your own situation. Other questions?
Go ahead. My name's Anita, and
Yes.
I have a business here in Ann Arbor.
Yes.
And I just want to say thank you so much for pressing through, and you've so empowered me and encouraged me, and I just can't even believe this, and I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming. I mean, that's, and what your comment makes such a difference for me, because I have to tell you, the biggest challenge that trauma patients have to deal with is mornings are the hardest. When you wake up, what happens is you don't really sleep that well. It's a real challenge to sleep, because you're just kind of up. You don't get a full night. You kind of sleep, then you're awake, and it's funny, because I always tell people, I'm always up at 3 in the morning every night. It's no matter what, and it's the worst time to be up, because all of the late shows have ended, and they haven't started with the morning shows yet. So there's just nothing. It's just horrible at 3 in the morning, because you don't have. There is a show I do like called World News. I think it's World News Now, and it's a great show for people who don't sleep. They know it. It's a great show, and it's called. Their slogan, I think, is for people who find sleep to be overrated. So I just think that's such a great. That's why I watch that from 3 to 4:30, and then the regular news kind of kicks in at 4. Then you can start getting your local at 4:30, and then they start running on CNN. They start running at 5 to 6. Actually, they have a show called Daybreak or New Day at 5 to 6, 6 to 7. So I know all the late night and early morning and evening shows that are at 2 or 3 in the morning. But thank you for that comment, because what happens is that you have to decide every day after a bad accident what you're going to do. And it's interesting, because I always tell people, not every day is a great day. Not every day you wake up and you're like, oh wow, it's going to be a great day. Because some days, like today with the weather the way it is, your body, for these kind of injuries, when it's wet and damp, it's really painful on your body. Your body because when you shatter stuff, what happens is, they've explained to me, is that because it's all shattered, it's arthritic. So you feel the weather and you feel all those things as it goes right into your body. So when you wake up in the morning, you just kind of don't feel good. You wake up and you're like, ugh, you just don't feel great. So you have to really kind of push yourself to kind of get out of bed, get dressed, put your clothes on. For me, I always do a swim in the morning, because that is very helpful. Swimming tends to kind of loosen the body up a little, and there's no impact. And also swimming, it's nice because it takes away the impact of when you're walking or when you're on your body. Whenever you have a hip or pelvis issue, because it's weight bearing, you feel it all the time. So the only time that is a little bit of a relief is in the water. So the waters are really nice because there's no compression when you're in the water. So, you just kind of push forward kind of like in the water. But her comment makes a huge difference, because when someone says like that, something nice and something kind, what you do is you basically wake up and you say, you know what, I'm gonna push forward today. And I'm gonna, get up and do what I need to do. And I think what you learn, and I think this is a lesson that hopefully maybe the hospital taught me that maybe is applicable to everybody here, but this is the lesson that I took from Mount Sinai and my treating physicians currently. This is something they taught me that was helpful. Not every day is gonna be a good day. Some days are gonna be really bad days. Your body's gonna have some days where it feels better than others. Your whole goal, whatever your situation is to allow for yourself to have a bad day. It's just kind of the way life is. But your goal needs to be that if you can try to make it so that the good days at least equal or outnumber the bad ones, then at least you're making progress. But that just needs to be your goal. Just try to make it so that at least there's a balance. So that way you don't have every day as a bad day, and at least you have some good days. And if you can say, wow, you know what? At least I'm having more good days than bad, at least or equal to, then it's a little bit better and a little bit more tolerable. So maybe try to do what I've been taught. When you're on campus and you're just dealing with all this stuff, just try to say, you know what, today's just a bad day. Tomorrow might be a bad day. But then at least say, okay, but at least I'm gonna try to at least have a few good days. And then if you have those few good days, those might make it a little easier to work through the bad ones. Other questions? Tricia?
And, I wanted to just comment on your being up in the middle of the night and
Yes.
the world news report and all of that.
Yes.
I have a whole enormous community of friends who are active in the disability community in Second Life, which is a 3D virtual world.
Mm.
And there is a version of Second Life that is accessible to people who are blind.
Mm.
And I have friends who are blind in Second Life. And because this virtual world wraps around the entire world, anytime you're awake, there's somebody somewhere else on the globe who is awake, who will talk with you and go dancing with you. It's an alternative to always watching the news.
I love that. Thank you for that. I think that's something I'm going to talk to my colleagues about afterwards. I think that could be a great, well, it's funny, we did just get back from Australia. And what's great about that is that I do sometimes, if you have to do work, you can do it with Australia, which is kind of nice, in other countries. I've always found that when we were in Australia, though, for some reason, whenever people called me in Australia, it always seemed to be 2 in the morning. I don't know what it was, but it seemed to always be, no matter how it worked, they always seemed to call you, no matter how you tried to plan it, they always called you at 2 in the morning. But thank you for that. I think that could be very helpful. Other questions?
The lady with the red jacket, yeah, you.
My name is Jocelyn. I'm
Yes.
a senior
Yes.
nursing student.
Yes.
And there's a small group of senior nursing students here.
Oh, wonderful.
Being in the hospital for an extended period of
Yes,
time,
yes.
what advice would you have for us
Oh,
nurses,
yes.
in taking care of patients?
I am so grateful that you asked that question. First off, if you ever want me to come to the nursing school, I would be honored to do it, because whenever you have someone who's been in a hospital, very few people stay for 10 weeks. That was how serious it was. I mean, a lot of people when they come to a hospital, they're usually in and out, or no matter how serious it is, they're there for a couple, whatever it is, they try to move you in and out. But for me, it was 10 weeks at Mount Sinai Hospital. So I will tell you that first off, thank you so much for going into your chosen profession. It is, and this is what I will tell you that from my experience of living in a hospital. Hospitals take on a world that is all to themselves. Until you've lived in a hospital, it's difficult to understand the world that just exists within the hospital walls. Number one, I would have to say that when you're in a hospital, the physicians are always going to be critical, but it's the nurses that make the experience. It is the nurses that I will tell you, because the physicians will come in a few times a day, they'll do their rounds, that kind of stuff. The people that I will tell you, hands down, that made the biggest difference, the biggest impact, and allowed for me to survive were the nurses. And it's not just the nurses. There are two groups that make up a hospital that really make it work. Don't get me wrong, the physicians are going to be critical because that's important. But you have to understand the physicians don't spend the day with you. So the physicians, they come, they do their rounds, but they're not there all day and all night. The nurses are, but there's one other group that is critical in a hospital, and it's the PCAs, patient care, I think they're patient care associates, or I think patient care associate, the PCAs. The PCAs are the most critical people in a hospital. Because what happens is the PCA is the one that is, okay, you know, a lot of this is very personal, but just since you have nurses here, it's great to talk about it because it's worth it. You have to realize when you're in this kind of condition, you can't do basic functions. Nothing. You can do nothing. But you still have to move a little bit because you're going to get like a decubitus ulcers, which is like a fancy word for just bed sore. So you have to be moved around, and you have to, these are the things that have to be done. But the people that do a lot of the moving are the PCAs. So what would happen is, as your time kind of progressed, you know, you wouldn't want to use, you didn't want to, even if you had to use a commode or do those kinds of things, you have to be lifted, you have to be placed. It's really hard, and it's horribly embarrassing for people that, you know, are very independent, because it's those basic things that that people take for granted that you're not able to do. It's indescribable how that feels when you can't do those things and someone is doing those for you. Now it used to work like every day. We would say it would be a huge The first thing is the mornings in a hospital are always the hardest, because the mornings when they do medications, when they do the shots, mornings are the worst. And then what happens is that, you know, you would have your nurse, you know, you'd always see the nurse, because the shifts are 7 to 7. So it was, you know, my nurses became like family. I loved my nurses. I had the most wonderful nurses that you could ever possibly hope for. They were so gentle. They were so kind. They were so warm. We became very much like family because they were so sensitive. It was wonderful. I had young nurses who were like just fantastic, filled with life and energy. And then I had a wonderful nurse who was old school, and she was wonderful. Old school, like she'd been a nurse for like 34, and they all had their own wonderful way of treating you, of working with you. Some had and I loved it. Both of them were all of them were wonderful, but I'm remembering all my nurses, and I'm remembering how kind and gentle and warm and loving and nurturing they were. They were just incredible. But I loved the two styles. There was one style that was like the younger, kind of very energetic, very enthusiastic. Then there was the other style that was more formal, but wonderful. Do you know what I mean? They had that formal way that they would do things. And I loved it because they were so loving and caring. They were kind of like a grandparent or, you know, a grandmother, and they just treated you so well. And it was funny because the younger ones you would call by like their first name, but there was one nurse that I just loved. She was just one of my favorite. And she had been working at the hospital literally for like, I think 30 or 40 years. So everyone still called her Miss, which is what I loved because it was formal. And I loved that. That was just how, when she was a nurse, it was the old school with the hat and the whole thing. And it was wonderful. Both styles were great. But the thing I want to emphasize, I don't want to go on too much longer, but this is such an important question that you asked, because I've never had a chance to really talk to nurses before to thank them for what they did. But I cannot express to you, I just can't express to you the impact that the nurses have on your care. Because you have to realize I had to get shots all day long. I mean, it got to the point where there wasn't any places for them to put the needles anymore because they were putting shots over shots. So the problem was that when you go in with the needle, there wasn't like a clear place to give it. Because for 10 weeks, you're doing shots all day long. You didn't have, it was just tough because there wasn't a single place that they could do it that they hadn't done it already. So it was like on top of each other. It was really brutal. But the point is that I would say the advice I would give to a nurse or anybody with that's like or a PCA or any of those things is understand that what you have to understand, the most difficult thing that the patient is dealing with, number one, there's going to be days that they're going to be upset and they're going to be frustrated. I remember when physical therapy used to come to my room and they would give you a sock. And the goal was you had to try to remember, I'm an Ironman. And now I'm sitting here trying to put a sock on. And they would come to your room and they would try to, you'd have to use a hook to put the sock on your foot. But the problem was when you're blind, you can't do it because you can't see where your foot is. It was just a nightmare. And then the other problem was that they had to walk you a little bit, but you couldn't because it was a mess because you couldn't ever put your left side down. So if you put your left side down, it would be a huge problem. But the problem was the nerves were all messed up. So the problem with that was you didn't know if you were putting your, so it was just, everything was a whole complication. But I remember though, the physical therapist would basically come and they'd have a sock and you'd have to use a hook to put the sock on your foot. And I got so frustrated. She said, okay, maybe let's not do this today. This is a little too much and we probably shouldn't do this today because you're getting too upset. And I said, I am not getting upset. I'm going to put this sock on my foot because this is, no, I was taking it off. It wasn't even putting it on, I was taking it off. And I said, I'm going to do this because this is ridiculous that I cannot take a sock off. So I took the hook and got so angry, I finally got the sock off and I flung it all across the room. And then the physical therapist said, well, okay, I understand what just happened here because they're used to this. And then she said, so what are you going to do now? It's a great question. What are you going to do now? You can't go and get the sock. You can't move. You don't know where it is. And what I realized was that I was going to be very blessed. That even though I've got a lot of issues from this accident, that over time I would be able to regain doing the things like putting a sock on. Now it still hurts and it's difficult, but it can be done. The point is that I realized that over time this could be done and you could do that. So the reason I'm going on so long is this is such an important issue, and because we have nurses here, what you have to recognize is number one, there's going to be days where your patients are going to be really upset. It has nothing to do with you. It's just the fact that these were people that were one day doing one thing and now doing a different thing. Just imagine one day you're out training for a marathon and now you can't use the bathroom. I mean, just think of how that feels. And you're going to get the brunt of that. But there's something that's very interesting that nurses will tell you, which is nice people become nicer when they're in the hospital. Difficult and challenging people become more mean when they're in a hospital. It's very interesting. So I was very patient and I was always very because I knew they were doing the best they could. But I'll tell you one really quick story. There was this one PCA that I really liked. And you have to realize I didn't shower for 10 weeks. They would do a sponge bath. And everyone thinks, oh, a sponge bath sounds so great. It's like people, from all the movies and TV shows, people are always like, oh, they always make the sponge bath out to be like some beautiful nurse giving you a sponge bath. What I can tell you about a sponge bath, it's horrible. There's nothing good about a sponge bath at all. It is so awful. Because what they do is you have to go into the bathroom and you have to be lifted, and it's a whole huge thing. And then what happens is that you're cold and you're wet and you're miserable because you're just sitting on a chair, and it's just awful. So basically they have to do it for you because you can't do it yourself. And it's interesting because the bathroom apparently is the most dangerous place in a hospital. It's where they fear the most, because what happens is people get impatient when they're in because you can't do anything. So, you have your privacy when you're doing what you're doing, but then they have to come back and do everything else. So you can't do anything on your own. So what happens is that people get impatient and they start trying to do things on their own and they all get injured. So the hospital bathroom, they're always very quick to the bath. Whenever someone hits the cord to say, okay, we're ready to move on to the next step, They're there instantly because they know that's where it's the most dangerous, because people will get frustrated, they're going to get upset, they're going to start moving around, and then there's going to be a problem. But I think the answer to the question is, it's not just about disabled people. What you have to realize, when you're a nurse, everyone is disabled in your unit. Everyone is not able to do something. You have to also remember that long-term care, if someone is there for a long time, it's hard. You have to become very close with them because you're going to know them. You're their family. They see you when they wake up. They see you when you go to sleep. Because it's 7 o'clock was when rounds would, no, actually the way it would work is at 6 o'clock, or hospitals start early. So 5 a.m., they would usually start with kind of your medications and your shots and all that kind of stuff. And then what would happen is at 7 a.m., the new nurse would come in. And I knew all the nurses because my ward, I got to know all the different nurses that I got to know. But you have to understand is that in my situation, I wasn't allowed to leave the ward or go outside or do anything. So I had no fresh air for 10 weeks. And I guess the answer to your question is, if you ever want someone to come and talk to your classes, to talk about long-term care and long-term hospitalization and the issues that people face who are in a hospital for a very long period of time, and everything that comes out of that long-term care, I'd be happy to do so. But I think the key things are, it's the simple things. Lifting them, toileting them, bathing them, washing them, giving them the shots, making them comfortable. It's the simple things that you're going to do for them that they can't do for themselves. That's the most challenging and difficult part of being in a hospital. And just recognize that, that they can't do things that they used to do, and that is unbelievably hard for people to deal with.
Richard,
I think we might be out of time. Oh, yes.
Okay, Anna from the council.
And I'm sorry, I won't go on that much longer, but that was a great question, and it's rare that you get a chance to actually talk to nurses, especially when you're a long-term. And I'll just end with one thing. Hospitals, and nurses, you're going to notice this. I always remember the announcements, because the worst about a hospital is at night. The nights are the worst, because hospitals are very quiet at night, except for my ward, because there was always either be announcements, and there would always be, each hospital has its own codes. So you'd start to learn the different codes that would come. And God, I think it was Team 6. What was it? I can't remember what it was. But Mount Sinai's code was, what was it? I think it was Team something. There was a team that they would call for, and it was a code. And that usually meant that somebody was dying. It was something team. They would always say, team so-and-so report to, they'd give the unit, the room number, the ward, that kind of thing. And that was always the sign that somebody was, they don't use like code blue like from the movies. They have, each hospital has its own kind of codes that they would use. And I remember Sinai's was something, I can't remember what it was, but boy, I hear that a lot. And that was, it's interesting, it just taught you the life cycle. Because you always knew when you heard that code that somebody was dying. And that was always a hard thing.
Could I
Yes.
ask a question?
Yes.
Anna from Council for Disability Concerns.
Yes.
I would like you to talk a little bit about Metro Airport, Delta Airlines, and your achievements there, because I would like this audience to know about the wonderful changes that you've made, not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone.
Well, Donna, thank you for asking that. That's a great question. This was a case that went on for about 5 years. And the whole goal of the case was to make airports accessible, airlines accessible. It wasn't always a right that people had to fly. So we have to make it so that people with disabilities can fly and can travel. And I have to say, after 5 years of litigation, I'm really excited because the airlines, look, air travel is horrible for everyone, but it's especially horrible for people with disabilities. But I'm really happy to say that after about 5 years of litigation, the airlines are taking it seriously, the airports are taking it seriously, and it's wonderful because of how they're rebuilding airports, how they're modifying airports, how they're altering airports, how they're changing airports. All the work that's being done at airports is really creating tremendous change. And what's exciting is that people with disabilities, because of the changes that have happened in US aviation, what's important to know, if you have a disability and you're traveling somewhere, there's now a new court order that's in place that allows you to travel with great ease. And here's the best part. It allows for you to travel outside the United States as well. So long as the aircraft is entering or leaving the United States, they must adhere to this court order. Otherwise, they can be in jeopardy of losing their certificate. So what that means is, if you're going, it's quite interesting. We just got back from Australia. I don't want to go, I feel bad that I'm going so long. We just got back from Australia, and in Australia, they had a huge issue with aviation, which was in Australia, it was at the discretion of the airline, if you're blind, to allow for you to travel by yourself. So let's say you're going from Sydney to Melbourne. It's the airline's discretion. If they feel that as a blind person, you shouldn't be able to travel by yourself, the airline has a discretion to deny you boarding of the plane. And their argument is, for safety reasons, blind people shouldn't be traveling by themselves. Now, that doesn't say that they always do it. It doesn't mean that they go out and throw blind people off the plane, but they have the right to. It is a discretionary call that exists within Australia, that if the air carrier wishes to deny passage to a disabled person on the basis of safety reasons, they have the right to do it. Do they do it often? I don't know. Do they have the right to do it? Yes. But the issue is that in the United States, you can't do that. And what's great is that our case kind of reinforces what the rights are, and it basically establishes the right for people with disabilities to travel by themselves and to receive the necessary level of assistance to allow for them to enter the airport, to travel, to fly. And what's great is that so long as that aircraft is entering or leaving the United States, they have to be accessible on both sides. So if you're going from, let's say, Detroit to Paris, they have to be accessible in Paris and in Detroit, because that's the rule, that's the law. And if they want to service the United States, they have to make it so that the same level of service that's provided in Detroit is provided at Charles de Gaulle. And you know what's wonderful? They're doing it. They're doing it well. That's not to say there aren't problems. I guarantee there's problems, tons of problems. But it's a lot better than it was, and they're working to make it better. Does anyone know what time it is?
Yeah, it's almost time for you to leave.
Well, oh, okay, so I want to just end with this one story that I think kind of helps to sum things up. It's the story of a pessimist and an optimist who once met on a street corner. The pessimist said to the optimist, "Why is the world such a harsh and challenging and difficult place?" The optimist said back to the pessimist, "I've always believed that the world is what we choose to make it." Ann Arbor, the university, all of you, just by coming here today, just by participating, what excites me, what energizes me, is you have all decided just what kind of world you want this to be. Thank you for this opportunity, and keep up the good work.